Okay, so this evening we are looking at scenario planning. So you will recall, those of you that participated last week or have had the chance to look at the recording, last week we were focused on looking at how we can reimagine our events in a COVID world. So we looked a lot at, examples. We particularly drew on some examples from Queensland and other states that are a little bit further progressed than Victoria. And we looked at some inspiration around what could your event look like in a COVID safe environment. So what we're doing this evening is we're looking more at scenario planning. So what we're doing is trying to imagine or predict in some sense what 2021 could look like. So we're going to go through the process. I'm going to share some insights with you initially, and then we're going to go into some practical exercises. Before we do that, I'll just do a quick introduction. Thank you everybody for introducing themselves. Those of you that haven't participated in any of our earlier sessions, I'm Linda Tillman and I'm the Managing Director of Tilma Group and also the founder of Revents Academy. So I work in regional tourism and events across all states and territories in Australia, and I've been doing that now for 12 years. Revents Academy is something I created to support events in regional and rural communities. So we do things like this. We do masterclasses, we do mentoring and coaching, we do strategic planning for events. So we do a whole range of different things to support the long-term viability and sustainability of events across regional and rural Australia. And through this period of COVID in 2020, we've been doing a lot of virtual masterclasses and just supporting events in getting through this challenging time, but also in understanding how they can successfully bounce back as we come out of this, this period that we are currently in. Now, as I said, the idea of the session this evening is really to follow on from last week's session where we looked at those examples and the inspiration around how we can reimagine our event. So what I want you to do as I'm talking to you for this first hour or so is just to think back to what we spoke about last week for those of you that have had a chance to watch that session, and just consider those ideas as we start to look at what the scenarios may look like for the events industry in Victoria in 2021. So the structure of our session tonight, the first part of the session, I'll be giving some insights and sharing some of my knowledge with you around scenario planning. And then, as I said, we're going to have a few more interactive exercises. So the things that you're going to learn this evening are what is scenario planning and why do we actually need to do it? So we're going to start from the base. What actually is it? Because a lot of events have lost a bit of I guess, knowledge around scenario planning. So what is it and how do we actually do it? We want to also look at what is the current situation in Victoria and what could the potential scenarios be for events in 2021. I'm going to talk to you about what are the practical steps around scenario planning. Then I've got a couple of examples of events and some examples of how we've been, I guess, teaching different events how to scenario plan. So I've produced a few examples just to give you that really practical insight into how to do that. Then what I want to do is potentially look at a local event. We'll see how we're going for time and how we go looking at those example scenarios that I've created. But what I'd like to do, if we have the time to do it, and if everyone's got the energy and willingness to participate, is to look at doing some scenario planning for a local event. So actually walking you through that process and doing it together so you've got a really good appreciation of what it looks like. Because in most cases, and for most events in Victoria, the scenarios will be very similar. The things that will differ will be what does your event look like to adapt to those particular scenarios. Then once again, what we're going to do is have some time at the end to have some conversations. So that's a bit of Q&A, open discussion about your events and scenario planning for your events in 2021. So if you've got any questions at all, if anything comes to your mind as I'm talking through this first section this evening, please pop anything into the chat box. What I'll do is when we get to that final session, I'll pull up that chat box and make sure that I address anything that may have popped into your mind during the session this evening. Also, as I said, we have 3 hours allocated for the session this evening. For you guys in Victoria, that will take you through till 9 p.m. That is our maximum time. What we will do is just keep an eye on the time and see how we're tracking, how the energy levels are, and play it by ear. Just also one final piece of housekeeping, the session is being recorded. So if you would like to look back at it at any point in time, you have to duck out for any particular reason this evening, please know that you can always come back to the recording and Nicole will share that with you as soon as it's made available. Okay, what is scenario planning? And I'd be interested for you to hear from you actually, and maybe pop something into the chat box, whether you do scenario planning regularly for your event. You may have actually heard it referred to as contingency planning. So when we look at risk management for events on an annual basis, we're always looking at contingencies. The what ifs. So we're looking at different scenarios and what if that happens? How would we react? How would we adapt? How would we reduce the risk associated with those issues? That's essentially what it is. It's really a way of looking at the future. What could happen? And thinking about the future and mitigating any risk, and you're setting yourself up for success based on what that future looks like. So typically what would happen is a team, so if we're talking about events, because businesses and organizations do a lot of scenario planning as well, but when we talk about events, we would get the team together and we'd develop a small number of scenarios. So what we're looking at there are really devising stories about how the future might unfold and how those stories might affect your particular event and what are the issues associated with that. And in our case, the issue is COVID-19. So it's a process that you may be familiar with. We're being forced to look at it right now because of COVID-19, but typically most events will be looking at this on an annual basis. Why do we need to do it? As I said, it's something that most events would be doing on an annual basis. And if not, it's something you should get into the habit of doing because it's not something that we just do when we're faced with a crisis. So it's where we're imagining those worst case scenarios. The difference with our discussion this evening and what I'm going to talk to you about is that we have our worst case scenario in front of us already. So we're not actually looking at what if. We actually have the worst case scenario, which is COVID-19, whether we like it or not. So what we're actually looking at is how our scenario planning is actually around our transition back to normal. So it's all about how we operate our events and what do they look like, particularly in 2021 or pre a vaccine. That's that uncertainty, right? We're all wondering at the moment, when are we going to have a vaccine? And in the meantime, what does our event look like? What restrictions are going to be in place? What is the consumer sentiment going to be like? Are we still going to be able to tap into our sponsors and our volunteers? There's all these unknowns. Once we get a vaccine, I guess the assumption then is that things could go back to some normality. But it's that transition period. It's that next potentially 6 or 12 months. And if we have an event scheduled within that time, what does that look like? And what will I have to do to actually deliver that event? The challenge we have is that we don't have that crystal ball. We can't predict what government regulations will be like around COVID-19. We can't predict if another wave will break out. We can't predict if, you know, something's going to happen and borders are going to be closed 2 weeks before our event. So there's a lot of uncertainties, and this is where scenario planning is really important, because it helps us to think clearly and think through the risks that could be associated with different scenarios, and it allows us to be able to plan for them. So there's a lot of big events that I've been working with that have been through this process, and there's 2 events in particular, and I'll just share with you briefly. So one is Tamworth Country Music Festival in New South Wales. Both of these events are in New South Wales, actually. So the Tamworth Country Music Festival, they're due to take place in January. So we had conversations with them maybe 6-8 weeks ago about the event, and at that time they were still going ahead in January with a fairly different model. So it was all indoor venues, so they weren't doing all of their street activity, busking, etc. was not permitted, but it was basically all indoor ticketed, completely seated events or activities, and they had completely remodeled that event. They'd also created some scenarios. So they looked at scenarios knowing that, you know, that was one scenario, was borders were still open. They would go ahead with all indoor venues in COVID safe operating procedures. They also had a whole range of other scenarios, you know, from, you know, borders completely being closed, no travel permitted. So it was almost from worst case scenario through to best case scenario. Unfortunately, they had to cancel their event because of, and this is where scenario planning is really hard, because you could come up with 5 or 6 different scenarios and then another curveball can be thrown at you. But in that case, what actually happened was legal repercussions. So it's a council run event, and council legal department decided that it was too risky for them, more from a health and safety perspective, and decided that they wouldn't move forward with that particular event. But they had a whole range of different scenarios in place that would allow them to adapt based on the situation that had evolved in New South Wales. Similar one is the Parks Elvis Festival, also held in January. So for them, it was really, you know, there's so many unknown factors. Parks Elvis Festival did a range of scenarios to look at, you know, what the event could look like within those different scenarios, including borders being open or closed. What does the bubble, a bubble around Sydney, do to their event? You know, they looked at a whole range of things around finances and economy and recession, etc. They basically got to a point where they were getting a lot of criticism, or I guess just community, I almost want to say backlash, but it wasn't that harsh, but there was a lot of community concern around what decision will they make around this festival, because it attracts, you know, thousands of people into the community of Parks. So they decided at that point they had to make a decision quicker than they had hoped. They did decide to postpone their event until March, so that gave them a bit more time to really see what these scenarios played out to be. Unfortunately, they had to also cancel their event because they looked at their scenarios and the impact that those different scenarios would have on their event. They got to a point where they decided that they could not deliver their event in any other format than they would typically run their event, which meant that they had to cancel 2021 and reduce or prevent any brand impact, and they will reintroduce their event in 2022 in the same format, hoping that there will be a vaccine in place and we'll be able to have outdoor unseated festivals and events. So lots of events at the moment are undergoing this process of scenario planning. They're looking at the what ifs, they're looking at the different, you know, the different, I guess, scenarios around border closures, government regulations, recession, economy, finance, consumer sentiment, whole range of things to get a really good sense of, well, what could our event look like in each of those scenarios? And then when do we make those decisions? So there's that crystal ball we all wish we had. These are some of the key unknowns that are really forcing us to need to scenario plan for 2021. And everybody's shared that with us this evening. You know, you're not sure about 2021. You're not sure what your event will look like. You've got some ideas, you're willing to be creative, but you're just not sure what it will look like. And these are the things that are really tough. These are the things that are making us need to scenario plan. Will things go back to normal before your 2021 event? Hopefully, we get that vaccine sooner than expected, and we may go back to normal. But we still don't know what normal looks like either, do we? You know, will Victoria suffer another wave and be locked down? We don't know. Will this come with any warning? Based on what's happened in the past, possibly not. Will the COVID-caused recession impact your event? So how's that going to impact consumer sentiment, volunteers, costs, sponsorship, all of those factors? And what regulations and costs will be forced on events in 2021? So there's all of these unknowns, and these are the things that we need to start bringing into our scenarios. What if that happens? What if that happens? Now, I've just got a couple of slides I want to share you just to, I guess, give some practical insight to where scenario planning is really important. So it's not just about scenario planning when there's a major crisis like COVID. As I said before, this is a process that events should be going through on an annual basis because there's many reasons why an event needs to undertake scenario planning, or as I said, contingency planning. So for events that are held in fire season, in a higher risk fire area, that's something you absolutely need to scenario plan for. This is a photo of Tenterfield in northern New South Wales. They have an event called the Peter Allen Festival. And last year, a bushfire started the day of that festival right on the edge of town. So you can see there the sky being filled with smoke. They would never have predicted that to happen. I mean, severe drought, you know, really dry, but it was a very unfortunate situation. So how do you plan for that? How do you deal with that? So for events that are in that high fire danger area, or even events that are in fire season or in the summer months, this is something you need to be scenario planning for. It's those worst case scenarios. Another event I'm familiar with that had to do some scenario planning was a one-off international sporting event. It was held in regional Queensland and it attracted over 30,000 people across 10 days from over 8 countries. This event was held, it was in the Southern Downs region of Queensland, and they had to contingency plan. Some of you may have heard this was last year, so God, can we even think or imagine what happened pre-COVID? But pre-COVID, you know, I guess the biggest talking point, particularly in Queensland, or the biggest issue we faced was drought. And we had some towns in southern Queensland that actually ran out of water. One of those being Stanthorpe in the Southern Downs, which is where this event was held. So this event had to look at contingency plans or, you know, alternative options and scenarios around water supply and drought, because this was a polo cross, an international polo cross event where a lot of water is required to water and wash horses. You had thousands of people camping at a ground. You had the town absolutely booked out for almost 3 weeks because of international competitors. So the extra pressure that puts on the natural resources locally when they don't have a lot. And the community's appetite for visitors was also a concern. So this event had to look at scenarios around what would they do if there wasn't water, how would they deal with this, and really think about the contingencies to make sure that that event didn't have any long-term impacts on the community and the residents. Then we've got weather. I mean, a lot of our events are outdoors, you know, and we love our outdoor events. And when we live in a country like Australia, and particularly Victoria, where we've got unpredictable weather, we need to be able to scenario plan around weather. Can you believe one of Queensland's first ever COVID safe events that was held this year, which was the Gold Coast Expo. So it's a caravan and camping expo. It was held in July this year, which is usually a fairly good time on the Gold Coast. They actually had wet weather. So you just can't underestimate these challenges that can happen to us in the events industry. So scenario planning is really, really important for events in general, not just in this COVID environment that we're in, but I want to just encourage you all to start thinking about scenario planning as a process that you go through with your event on an annual basis, and start thinking more about what are those other things that could impact your event. All right, now I want to talk to you about the steps to scenario planning. It's a pretty straightforward process, but I just want to set the scene by talking through these steps with you, and then we're going to look at a couple of examples, because I find scenario planning is one of those things that we can talk about it for a long time, but it's not actually something that you really appreciate until you've actually done it and you sit down and you go through the process. So the steps in scenario planning, first of all, you want to gather together your team, your key committee or organisers, and also some of your main stakeholders to hold a brainstorming session. Diverse views and different perspectives add a lot of value to this process. So what you're wanting to brainstorm is, what are the future scenarios? And this is often the hardest part of scenario planning, because once you can define what those future scenarios are, because we're kind of making assumptions, we're trying to, you know, have a bit of crystal ball glaring. It's actually a fairly challenging process. So get as many people together as possible. You often sit down and do some research and just think about, okay, what could the future scenarios be? The second step in scenario planning is then to identify, you want to identify the driving forces that will affect your event. So what are the big changes that will impact your event in the coming months or years? And in our case, we're considering those that are related to COVID-19. We also want to think about those that are related to the economy. There's political issues that we need to consider as well, the environment, and also legal factors. So regulations around COVID. Remember the example I just shared with you with Tamworth Country Music Festival. So they did all of their scenario planning. You know, they considered the implications. They were able to adapt the event model to suit each of those scenarios. But then legal factors came into play, and unfortunately that resulted in them having to cancel their event for 2021. So there's a lot of different forces that come into play, which is why we need to start looking at what they are within our different scenarios. So basically that's having that discussion, brainstorming what those are, and also developing a list of the main driving forces. So they're anything that will affect your event. The third step is then to identify the critical uncertainties that will affect your event. So you've developed that list of driving forces in step 2. So from that list, you're going to choose the 2 that will have the most impact on your event. Because what you'll find is you'll start to prioritize those. You'll start to look at them to think, yeah, this is important, but it kind of sits under another one, or this one's more important and it's going to have more impact on our event. So it's really a critical analysis of each of those different factors to identify which two are going to have the biggest impact on your event. Once you've identified those, then you're able to develop your scenarios. So this is the typical kind of matrix that you will develop. Sometimes it can be a lot more complex than this. You might have, more scenarios. You may have more, different driving forces that you need to take into consideration. But in this case, I just want to share with you a really straightforward way of doing scenario planning. So basically what you do, you've got your critical uncertainties. So you're just creating a matrix. And once you've created that matrix, then you're able to draw your 4 possible scenarios. So these is where you start to look at the story. What is the story around that scenario? We've got a couple of creatives here this evening that would be familiar with, script writing or storytelling or, writing a movie scene. It's kind of what you're doing when you're scenario planning. You're building a bit of a plot and you're developing your story around it based on those critical uncertainties. So when our team sat down and thought about this, so really thinking about the variety of events held across regional Australia, you've got cultural festivals, you've got sporting events, you've got business events. We went through this process, and for us, we thought the critical uncertainties that will affect events over the next, say, 12 months were government regulations around COVID and the depth of the economic recession. Because if we think about that, if we think about, the government regulations around COVID, so we're talking about border closures, we're talking about, guidelines for COVID safe events and the cost involved of activating those guidelines. They're going to have big impacts on events. Then when we look at the economic recession, it's all around finances. Events will become more expensive to run. Will our attendees or consumers have that disposable income to actually attend events? Will we be able to tap into enough sponsorship? What's that corporate scene going to look like? So they're kind of factors for us. We thought, that could have a real impact on events in the next 12 months. So for us, we ended up with, as you can see on the screen right now, the critical uncertainties being the COVID situation and economy. So just keeping it really simple. And then we have the 4 scenarios. So when we talk about the COVID situation, that axis ranges at one end of the scale where life is pretty much as it used to be pre-COVID, with or without a vaccine. Life is good. That's where COVID safe gatherings can take place. Then at the other end of the COVID situation scale, that's where we're in lockdown and mass gatherings are not permitted. So you start to create this scale. When we look at the economy, that axis ranges from the economy ticking along without a huge impact on spending. So many in society are still employed and they've got regular incomes. The other end of that scale is an economic disaster where many have lost their incomes due to COVID, the economy's tanking and spending is way down. So you can see we have created these 4 scenarios. Scenario 1 is the economy's okay and the COVID situation is okay. Scenario 2, the COVID situation's okay, economy is bad. Scenario 3, economy okay, COVID situation bad, or economy bad. Oh, sorry, scenario 4, economy bad and COVID bad. So that's where you start to create your scenario. So you can see we've identified those critical uncertainties, or those key things that are going to affect our events into the future. And I want you to think about that, because as we come to work on our potential local event scenario planning this evening, I just want you to think, are there other things that could be affecting Victorian events into the future apart from those two? Or do you think they are fair to say would be the critical uncertainties for events in regional Victoria over the next 12 months? They're the things we're mostly unsure about. So basically then, from creating our 4 scenarios, we now just start to flesh it out. So we go scenario 1. We've just called it good. I like to keep things simple. It's good. That's the good scenario. So gatherings go back to almost normal because COVID is contained and the economy is ticking along okay. So that's our good scenario. Sorry, my screen just flashed. Can everybody still see that? Yes, great. Then if we look at scenario 2, this is where we start to look at, it's not too bad. So gatherings can go back to almost normal with COVID being contained. But in this scenario, the economy is tanking bad. So you can see there on the screen, basically what we've done is we've dropped in, okay, what does that mean? What could that mean for our events? Sponsorship may be more competitive. People won't have disposable income. So how does that impact on consumer sentiment, ticket sales, etc.? We could attract new volunteers if unemployment rates are high. We might be able to tap into new volunteers through volunteer programs. And we may need to seek grant funding to consider adjusting our event. If we go into scenario 3, that's bad. So I'm going to call this bottom right quadrant scenario 3. So this is where the economy is bad, tanking quite badly, and gatherings are banned as COVID infections start to spike. So this is our worst case. We do not want this to happen, but it's a realistic scenario, right? I hate to say that, but it is a realistic scenario that we need to be prepared for, because before we get a vaccine, there is always a chance that there could be another wave that could break out anywhere, not just Victoria. It could happen anywhere. So in this case, we're looking at, gatherings heavily restricted or banned. Borders will be closed, so no interstate travel. People won't have a lot of disposable income because of the financial situation. So this is where events need to look at, do we go virtual or do we cancel? Sponsorship's going to be competitive. So that's a really bad scenario, but we still need to think about that as a scenario and be prepared for it. And then scenario 4, down in our bottom left, this one is not too good, not too bad. So gatherings are banned. So in that sense, it's not good. Gatherings are banned because COVID infections spike, but the economy is ticking along okay. So this is where there's opportunity to create cells within the event. You know, this is where we start to look at, well, what does our event look like? We're not allowed to have mass gatherings, but we be able to work with venues that have COVID safe plans. You know, can we create alternative models and site plans that allow us to run smaller boutique gatherings, similar to what we were talking about with our reimagining in our last masterclass? So you can see there we've created 4 different scenarios, which are fairly general type scenarios relevant to the events industry across all of regional Australia, based on the COVID situation and the economy. So once again, I'm keen to know from you, so be thinking about it. Is there anything else from your perspective that should be considered from a scenario planning point of view? Or are they likely to be the key uncertainties for your events? The final step then in scenario planning, once you've actually identified those 4 scenarios, you've had a really good think about what do they look like, what do they mean, then you need to evaluate those scenarios and discuss the implications for your event. This is where decisions need to be made. So once again, this is where you want to bring the team together to have a conversation about, you know, the impacts of each scenario and how you could adapt or adjust your event in response. This is where we bring in what we spoke about in our last masterclass around reimagining our event. So for every scenario, those 4 scenarios, we need to imagine what our event looks like in that scenario. Because what that does is it takes the pressure off you. It allows you to go, okay, we now know if that happens or that scenario becomes a reality, we already know what decisions we're going to make. We already know what we need to do with our event. It relieves that pressure and anxiety of like the unknown. Well, what if this happens? So it's a really good tool to assist in decision making and to make sure that you've really made well thought through decisions. Now, a few things that you want to consider. So when you're evaluating those scenarios and you're starting to think about the implications for your event or what it means for your event, there's a few things that you want to consider. You need to continue to revert back to your event's why. And you'll recall me talking about this quite a bit in our first masterclass. And I talk about this in nearly every session, coaching, masterclass, whatever it is I do with events. This is always critically important. So whenever you're looking at those scenarios and looking at the implications for your event, I want you to think back to the why. What's the purpose of your event? Because if any of these scenarios are going to take you too far from your core purpose or your why, then you need to question whether it's worth doing. Some events are actually going, you know what, based on the scenarios that we're creating, we just can't see how our event can work within those scenarios. So we're just going to pause for a bit longer and come back even stronger in 2022. Parks Elvis Festival is a classic example of that. So you need to always come back to your why. You need to determine, is the risk and effort worth it? If it totally satisfies your why, it allows you to innovate, you know, it's a good renewal process for your event, then absolutely do it. I do not suggest holding back. But you need to make sure it aligns with the core purpose. You need to also keep your ideal attendees in mind. What are their needs? Can their needs still be met as you reimagine your event for each scenario? So if you need to remodel your event for each scenario that we talk about, does that still satisfy the needs of your attendees? If it doesn't, you need to think very clearly and closely on that. You need to keep your treasurer close by or your finance manager close by. and really understand your financial break-even point. Because your break-even point might be different in each scenario because your costs and your revenue streams may change. So when you're looking at the different scenarios, also think about the financial model around that particular scenario. Because once again, we are not in this to, you know, work really hard and, you know, lose money. So you need to think through the financial aspect of each of your scenarios. And the final thing is just to, you know, really open your mind to new opportunities. So when you're looking at the different scenarios, and I'm not going to talk about this in detail because this was the main topic of our first masterclass, but it is so important that when you're doing scenario planning that you open your mind to reimagine what your event could look like, because the exciting part of that is that sometimes these things like this force us to do things different, to change, to innovate, to adapt. And that can often be a really exciting direction for the future of your event that you perhaps would never have considered. So stay open-minded when you start looking at each of those scenarios. All right, I'm just going to share with you now. So a couple of examples of events that we put through this scenario planning matrix that we created. So once again, this was a matrix we created to be as generic as possible for regional events across Australia. We're all going through the same challenges. We're at different stages of that process, different states and territories. However, we're still all waiting for a vaccine. Essentially, what we're waiting for is to know when we will have a vaccine and what does new normal look like. So, as I said before, based on that, the uncertainties that we were comfortable in putting forward were, you know, what the COVID situation is and what the regulations are around that at the time. So that's a real uncertainty. The other one is the uncertainty around the economy. So this was a small, I won't use names of events, but we have used real events to put through this process just to see how it can work and to give you a bit of insight into how it works as well. So this is an example of a small town, so a small rural town festival, which is really heavily based around producer markets, flea markets. So a lot of market stall holders and street activity. So when we looked at this particular event, we basically said, okay, when we look at scenario one, the COVID situation is okay, the economy is okay, so that's our best case scenario. What does this event look like? So they could run the event almost as normal with a COVID safe plan in place. So they could still have their market stores, they could still have their street activity. They would just have to have a COVID safe plan in place and be able to have that approved by Department of Health. So that's based on our scenario one. If we look at scenario two, this is where the COVID situation is okay. So it's under control, but the economy is tanking quite bad. So from a COVID perspective, they can still run the event close to normal. And the challenge there is we're not really sure what normal means these days. But what we would suggest is that they run it as an inexpensive event to attend. They'd still have to have their COVID safe planning in place and that will all have to be approved. But because the economy is tanking bad, they need to start thinking about, okay, if there's not as much money in the economy, there's not as much disposable income, what do we need to do to make our event as affordable as possible? So seeking grant funding, you know, making free elements in their event, trying really hard to introduce elements that are going to be affordable for their audience. Then when we look at, and sorry, another point just on that was also looking at their financial model. So obviously in that case, when you start to think about the economy being bad, so starting to have more free elements, making the event as inexpensive as possible means that there's potentially a reduction in revenue streams. So what does your financial model look like? You need to start considering, well, if we've got increased costs as a result of being COVID safe, but we've got reduced income as a result of a bad economic situation, then how do we make the financial model work? And that's a really important factor in scenario 2 that needs to be looked at. In scenario 3, our worst case scenario that we are praying doesn't happen. That's where we have a really bad economy and the COVID situation has escalated again. So we've had another wave, it's out of control. So borders are closed, no interstate travel, very localized activity. So in this case, the suggestion for this particular event is to go virtual. So a lot of markets, producer markets, flea markets, etc., have been operating in a virtual space, or we suggest they just cancel and have a year off from their event. Then we look at scenario 4. So the economy is okay, doing okay, but the COVID situation unfortunately has escalated. So in this case, for this small market-based festival, we would look at going virtual. So the same as in our scenario 3, look at the virtual option or a hybrid option. So some elements could be virtual and some could be more very kind of boutique style, localized face-to-face, which would be like a series of small high-end events. And obviously they'll need to have a COVID safe plan in place, or they would just take a year off as well. And it all comes down to the financial model. How do they actually balance the budget in each of those cases when it's such a high risk situation? Now, another example I wanted to share with you is an arts-based festival. So this is a festival that is in the outdoors. It's arts, performing arts based, and it's an event that typically attracts large crowds to a range of different live entertainment in public parks and gardens. So when we looked at this particular event, we go scenario 1. What they could consider doing, so the COVID situation's okay, the economy's okay-ish. So run the event as normal with a COVID safe plan in place. Once again, what we don't know there from Victoria's perspective is what that COVID safe plan will require. So, we are, I guess, making some assumptions here that the COVID safe planning process in Victoria will be very similar to that in Queensland and other states. The other thing they may want to consider in that scenario is reducing their ticket price or targeting higher income earners to their events. So more boutique, high-end style format. Scenario 2, COVID situation okay, economy bad. So in this case, we want them to seek grant funding to reduce the cost of attendance. And that really, we don't know what grant funding will be available either, but the assumption there is that there will be government support to be able to assist the running of events. The third option is economy bad, COVID bad. So this is very similar to the other event. Once again, we get to a high risk proposition, which means from a financial perspective, you've got to balance the return on effort. So when the economy is bad and the COVID situation has escalated again, the only option really for this event is to go virtual, which they can. or to cancel and take the year off and use the energy to put into the following year. And the COVID situation bad and economy doing okay is our scenario 4. And in this case, once again, go virtual, or they do have the option to do a series of smaller boutique events. So we won't be able to have gatherings. You know, if we think back to what the restrictions were in Queensland or even what they are in Victoria now, it'll be very similar. So, you know, less than 50 people in an open or outdoor space. So really small boutique style events. Once again, absolutely critical to consider the financial model to make that viable. And you'll remember last week I talked about the event in Noosa Alive, and how they have reimagined their event. It makes me think about that event. So they've actually turned what we call a free range model into a controlled seating event. So if they needed, you know, this would be something that they would do in, they could do this in scenario, they could probably do it in scenario 4. I wouldn't do it in scenario 3 because it's just too risky. But essentially what Noosa Alive did was they actually turned, and it was similar to what I was talking about, talking to Tiffany at the start of our session this evening, was they turned that free range entertainment model into controlled seating. So they actually had performers move, the performers actually moved rather than the audience. The performers actually moved around to a smaller seated crowd. So it was in public parks and gardens still, and they moved into, like, they had smaller crowds, they were all seated, and they actually moved the performers to these smaller crowds rather than having, you know, these crowds of people moving around and mingling and increasing the chance of that reduced social distancing. So a really good example of what you can do to adapt to that smaller crowd number without impacting on the event. So that just gives you a bit of an idea of how you start to look at, well, what does that mean for my event once you've created those scenarios? So it's a real process, right? And like I was saying before, it's hard for me just to talk you through it because it's something you need to sit down and actually do. So you need to just think, okay, what are the different scenarios for Victoria? Now, how does that impact on my event? And what does my event look like in each of those scenarios? How do we overcome some of the potential challenges that may arise in each of those scenarios? All right, I've just got a little bit more talking and then I'm going to open up for some group discussion. Now, the current situation for events in Victoria. It's really tough. You know, we still don't know a lot about the, you know, road to recovery, I guess, for the events industry. What we do know is that they are at the bottom of the priority order right now. Anything that is around, you know, bringing mass crowds together is not high on the priority list for the state government at the moment. However, I guess the exciting thing is to see what's happening in some other states and territories where they're continuing to reduce the restrictions, particularly around events. And if I was just talk to Queensland for a moment, we are actually, you may have heard, but we've actually got more reduced restrictions taking place today, actually tonight, Tuesday. We do have the state of origin in Brisbane tomorrow night. Whether or not that's a coincidence, I'm not sure, but all outdoor stadiums as of tonight can have 100% capacity. So it will be very interesting to watch Suncorp Stadium tomorrow night with a max crowd, and the impact that that may have. Be really interesting to see, but that is a positive sign, because if we're able to do it in Queensland, Victoria is tracking so well in terms of you know, cases of COVID. I would like to think that there'll be some, you know, some recovery moving quite fast if that remains the case for the state. So we don't have a lot to share with you tonight in terms of the current situation for events in Victoria, and Nicole is, you know, a really good resource for you to tap into as things continue to be announced or evolve. But essentially, stage 3 of reopening, from what I can see, will commence around the 22nd of November. Some of the things, and you guys may have seen this. If you haven't, make sure you have a look at, you know, the roadmap to reopening, because it gives some good detail in there around what can and can't be done. Some things you need to read between the lines a little, but it certainly gives you some good insight. Unfortunately, you know, there's no clear date or indication of when there may be any further guidelines or direction released for festivals and events. So it's just watch this space. I have heard through some colleagues in Victoria that Visit Victoria are likely to be releasing guidelines within 2 to 3 weeks, but then I talk to other people and they're not too sure. So I don't want to guarantee anything to you, but I guess it is just about, you know, watching this space, and all we can do at the moment is look at these scenarios. So with that said, I just wanted to share what we did know about Victoria. So what it's looking like is very similar to the process that Queensland went through in terms of reopening. So, you know, seated outdoor events are the things that are making progress. So they're really focused on events that are outdoors and seated and controlled ticketing. So obviously it's about how do we control numbers, how do we contact trace, how do we make sure that we've got really good control around gatherings, social distancing, and making sure that we are preventing a lot of close contact. So those seated outdoor events with up to 500 are permitted with a 1 per 4 metre square rule. So there's been some progress in that space. Any events that are events or festivals that are outdoors or unseated, they're not yet covered in Victoria. So I believe that's being tabled later this month, but that's where the uncertainty lies, is around unseated events. If we're talking about music festivals, mainly seated, there's not much direction around what that could look like at the moment. Once again, if I was to share with you what's happening in Queensland, we are allowed to have festivals up to 5, I think it's up to 10,000 now. We are allowed to, as long as the biggest, I guess, challenge for events, all events in Queensland at the moment, are we can have events that have really strict COVID safe plans in place, but those COVID safe plans have to go through a very rigorous approval process from the Department of Health. So that is a real challenge for a lot of events at the moment, but there's been a few teething issues with that, but it's certainly getting better. But that's just a bit of positive light for you to know that things are moving, you know, quite fast up here in Queensland, and would hope that Victoria will be the same soon. The other thing is that market stores can open. So we already have a couple of you on our session this evening that are involved in markets. So you're well aware that markets are open, but things like, you know, presentations, buskers, live music, or anything where people are encouraged to come together in a crowd is not permitted at market stores. So I guess it's about thinking, for the market stall organisers, is thinking about how can you create that atmosphere and that environment without encouraging people to congregate. So what does that look like? Is it about having, you know, seating areas and people have to, just sit in that area, nobody's allowed to stand, so that can control a crowd. They're the things that we need to think about in terms of getting those value add elements added back in. So once again, I know that's not a lot to share with you in terms of the current situation in Victoria, but it's really important that you keep a close eye on announcements and new guidelines and restrictions, or the reduction of restrictions as they come into play. Because I know, just once again from being in Queensland, that it's happened faster than we actually anticipated, which is really positive. We just hope that it can be managed well. And it's that whole thing, right? We don't have that crystal ball. So this is once again why it's important for us to look at scenario planning to understand how your event may exist in 2021. I found this quite interesting and wanted to share it. I guess this is me, reading between the lines a little bit. This was an article in the paper yesterday. So there's some Australian Open discussions that are taking place. And I think this can provide a bit of insight into the thinking from the Victorian government. Basically what they're suggesting is that all of the Australian Open, all parts of the Australian Open, even the lead up events, the post events, are all held in Victoria. So rather than having some in Brisbane, some in, Adelaide, etc., having it all in one place so that we don't have particularly competitors that come in internationally having to move between states and quarantine. So that's the conversation that's taking place. The thing I found interesting from this article was I've highlighted a few points there. So as you can see, the absolute priority for the government is avoiding a third wave in Victoria. So they are not prepared to take any risk until there is a vaccine. And we know that public gatherings or mass gatherings with large crowds are high risk. So that was one thing I wanted to point out. The other thing is you can see, it's going to have to look different. Like we discussed in our first masterclass, there is this real need for events to be reimagined. What does our COVID safe event look like? Do I have a new program? Is it a new layout? Is there a new financial model? And you can see there, they're already suggesting the public health team need to sign off on all arrangements. So like in Queensland, as I just said, that process of stringent public health sign off on events and their COVID safe plans will be a critical step in hosting an event in Victoria moving forward. And our next masterclass session is on COVID safe plans. So we will look closely at that to support you in understanding how to actually develop a COVID safe plan for your event. So I just wanted to share that with you because I thought, there's some key things that came up. That's obviously just a little extract from the article, but they were some things that stood out to me, suggesting that the government is expecting that events will be reimagined to be COVID safe. There'll be a need for public health sign off, and their absolute priority, and that's understandable, right? The absolute priority is to avoid a third wave, and we all want that. So they're the things we need to be thinking about when we look at scenario planning or thinking about our events into the future.